Most people think their morning starts when their eyes open, but the truth is that your morning starts the moment your mind begins running its silent script. Before you even sit up, something inside you is already deciding how the next 12 hours will feel. And the wild part is that you barely notice it happening. You think you are choosing your day, but in reality your day has already chosen you. Before we continue, a quick note. Many of you watch our videos but haven't subscribed yet, so please subscribe to our channel Restwise and join our growing community. We'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's amazing to see how connected we all are. If you enjoy relaxing with philosophy, psychology, and science while drifting into sleep, give this video a like and stay with us on the journey. Now, let's get back to the video. There is this tiny moment right after waking when the mind is soft, unguarded, almost willing to believe anything. And in that moment you are giving yourself instructions without realizing it. Some people reach for their phone and instantly train their brain to react instead of lead. Others stay still for a few seconds and unknowingly create a sense of control before their feet even hit the floor. It feels harmless. It feels like nothing. But these small rituals are running your life far more than the big decisions you wrestle with later. Imagine this. You wake up and the first thing you see is a notification that makes your chest tighten. Maybe it is work. Maybe it is someone you did not want to hear from. Your body does not wait for you to think about it. It fires off stress hormones immediately. Your breathing changes. Your focus narrows. And without a single conscious choice, the tone of your entire morning has already been engineered by something outside you. Many people never even question it because it feels normal. But normal does not mean neutral. Normal just means repeated enough times for the brain to accept it. You might not realize how fast the mind latches onto a pattern after waking. Neurologically, the brain shifts from sleep to alertness in stages, and the earliest stage is the most programmable. Whatever you feed it becomes the default lens for the rest of the day. Think about that. The mood you carry through the afternoon may have been decided in the first 60 seconds of your morning, long before you brushed your teeth or planned your day. And the part that really stings is this. Most of these habits were not chosen by you. They were installed. Maybe your family rushed every morning when you were young. Maybe someone taught you to start every day by worrying about what could go wrong. Maybe your job conditioned you to wake up already bracing for stress. Old patterns slipping into a new day. No conscious permission, just repetition. But here is the reassuring thing. You are not broken for operating this way. You are human. The brain defaults to whatever is easiest to automate because it wants to conserve energy. It is not judging you. It is simply running the script it believes will keep you alive with the least effort. The problem is that survival mode is not life mode. And if you are not careful, your mornings become a never-ending loop of reacting, rushing, and feeling one step behind before breakfast. Here is where things get interesting. You do not need a complicated routine to break this cycle. You do not need a color-coded schedule or a cold plunge or a sunrise meditation on a mountaintop. You only need to reclaim that first quiet moment when your mind is still deciding how to interpret the world. If you change that moment, even slightly, everything downstream shifts with it. The brain loves consistency. So if you train it to expect calm instead of chaos, it adapts quickly. Picture yourself waking up tomorrow. Instead of grabbing your phone, You sit up slowly and take a single deep breath. That is it. One breath. Your nervous system reads that as a sign that you are safe. Safe people make better decisions. Safe people think more clearly. Safe people move through their day with intention instead of tension. And all you did was give your brain a different opening note. Once you start noticing these unconscious patterns, it becomes almost impossible to ignore them. You start to see how your mornings have been quietly steering your mood, your productivity, your relationships, even your sense of identity. And as you notice it, you begin to feel something dangerous in the best way. You feel choice. You feel agency returning. Not in a dramatic, life-changing way, but in a subtle shift of awareness that slowly rewrites the direction of your day. Because the truth is simple. Your mornings are not small. They are not neutral. They are the first domino. And when that first domino falls the right way, the rest of your day finally has space to follow. Your automatic reaction to stress. It is strange how fast your body reacts to stress. Faster than your thoughts, faster than your logic. There is this split second when something unexpected happens, and before you can form a single clear idea, your system has already chosen a response. Your breathing shifts. Your muscles tighten. Your mind narrows. You do not decide any of it. It decides for you. What most people never realize is that this automatic reaction was not built in one moment. It was shaped over years by the environments you lived in, the people you grew up around, and the situations that trained your brain to expect a certain kind of threat. And once that blueprint is laid down, your body follows it without asking permission. A harmless message feels urgent. A small mistake feels catastrophic. A simple request from someone becomes evidence that you are falling behind. None of this is conscious. It is a reflex that learned to fire long before you had the awareness to question it. Here is the wild part. Your mind reacts to stress the same way it reacts to physical danger. Evolution taught it to keep you alive, not to keep you calm. So when you feel overwhelmed by something that is not truly dangerous, your body still launches the old survival protocol. Adrenaline, tension, shallow breathing, racing thoughts. You think something is wrong with you, but this is exactly what your brain thinks is supposed to happen. The part that hits hardest is when you start noticing how often this reaction gets triggered by things that do not deserve that level of intensity. A small delay, a miscommunication, a look from someone, a memory that floats up. Your system snaps into alert mode as if your life depends on controlling the outcome. And because it feels automatic, you assume it must be accurate. But automatic does not mean correct. It only means practiced. Think back to the environments that shaped you. If you grew up around unpredictability, your body learned to prepare for impact. If you spent years in situations where you had to prove yourself, your body learned to anticipate criticism. If people around you reacted loudly, emotionally, or explosively, your system adapted to stay on edge. Not because you were weak, because your brain is efficient. It saved these patterns so it could fire them instantly. And here is the part no one tells you. Your automatic reaction to stress is not trying to ruin your life. It is trying to protect you based on outdated information. The problem is that it acts so quickly that you never get the chance to ask whether the threat is real. You go from 0 to tense without a pause in between. It feels like you are being thrown into the deep end over and over, even when the water is barely up to your knees. But there is something incredibly empowering about understanding this. Because once you see the pattern, you can interrupt it. You can create a tiny moment of awareness between the trigger and your response, and even the smallest pause changes the entire direction of your reaction. One breath slows the heart rate. One question interrupts the spiral. One moment of noticing resets the entire chain of automatic behavior. Imagine this. Something stressful hits you. Instead of letting your body drag you into survival mode, you catch the first physical cue. Maybe your shoulders rise. Maybe your jaw tightens. Maybe your stomach drops. The moment you feel that shift, you name it silently in your mind. You are not judging it. You are just acknowledging it. That simple act pulls your brain out of unconscious reaction and into conscious awareness. It is like turning a bright light on inside a dark room. The threat does not feel as big. The urgency fades, and your body finally realizes it does not need to protect you with full force. What makes this so powerful is that you only need a few of these interruptions before your nervous system begins to trust a new pattern. You show it that not every tense moment is a crisis. You teach it that presence works better than panic. And slowly your automatic reaction to stress shifts from survival to clarity. The real turning point is when you stop believing that your first reaction is the truth. It is only the echo of old conditioning. And once you see that, you take back the choice your body has been making for you all these years. How you choose your circle without knowing it. It is strange to realize that the people in your life were not chosen in a single dramatic moment. You did not sit down with a list and decide who would influence your confidence, your beliefs, and your direction. Instead, your circle formed through 100 tiny unconscious choices that felt harmless in the moment. A small preference here, a moment of comfort there, a familiar energy that reminded you of something from your past. And before you knew it, your environment was shaping you more than your intentions ever did. Think about how you naturally gravitate toward certain people. Most of the time, it has nothing to do with logic. Your brain scans for familiarity long before it scans for compatibility. It looks for people who feel like something it already understands. Maybe they have a similar rhythm of talking. Maybe their humor feels comfortable. Maybe the way they respond to stress echoes something you grew up around. Familiarity feels safe because the brain loves patterns, even when the patterns are not actually healthy. This is why so many people end up with a circle that reflects their past, not their goals. You may find yourself drawn to people who match the emotional environment you are used to, even if that environment was chaotic, distant, or unpredictable. Your mind chooses them without asking your future what it needs. It chooses what feels natural. And what feels natural is simply what has been repeated. You might think you are selecting your circle based on shared interests or personalities, but the deeper truth is that your nervous system plays the biggest role. If someone's presence calms your body, you move closer. If someone activates old tensions or unresolved insecurities, you either avoid them or, strangely, feel pulled toward them because your brain thinks it can finally solve an old problem. Without realizing it, you build a circle that mirrors your inner world. Here is where it gets even more interesting. You also choose people based on the role you unconsciously believe you must play. If you grew up being the responsible one, you attract people who lean on you. If you grew up feeling unseen, you might choose loud personalities who take up space so you can stay in the background. If you were used to managing other people's emotions, you may end up surrounded by friends who make that your job. It is not intentional. It is muscle memory, And what you tolerate shapes your circle just as much as what you pursue. You may allow certain behaviors because they fit a story your mind has accepted as normal. Maybe you excuse disrespect because conflict once felt dangerous. Maybe you accept emotional distance because attention feels overwhelming. Maybe you cling to people who drain you because your brain confuses intensity with importance. Every allowance becomes a silent vote that this is who belongs in your life. But here is the part that matters most. When you finally become aware of these unconscious choices, your circle starts to shift, often quietly and gradually. You begin noticing who leaves you depleted after a conversation and who leaves you steadier. You feel the difference between people who want the version of you that is convenient for them and people who welcome the version of you that is still growing. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Imagine paying attention to the micro signals. The small relief you feel when you talk to someone who listens without rushing you. The heaviness that settles in your chest after interacting with someone who keeps you defending yourself. The ease of being around someone who lets you breathe without performing. These sensations are not random. They are data. Your body often knows the truth about your circle long before your mind catches up. And when you start adjusting your life based on that data, even slightly, everything changes. You stop chasing people who make you feel unstable. You stop shrinking yourself around people who only value your silence. You stop mistaking closeness for connection. Instead, you slowly build a circle that aligns with who you are becoming rather than who you used to be. The most empowering part of all this is realizing that your circle is not fixed. You are allowed to outgrow people. You are allowed to choose differently. You are allowed to prioritize your peace over your patterns. And the moment you do, you begin to attract relationships that support the life you actually want, not the one you unconsciously inherited. The hidden thoughts that shape your identity. There is a moment you rarely notice when you are alone with your thoughts and your mind whispers something so quietly that you barely register it. A tiny comment about who you think you are. A soft judgment. A subtle prediction about what you can or cannot do. And even though it feels harmless, that whisper becomes the blueprint your identity builds itself around. Not through loud declarations, but through repeated private thoughts that eventually solidify into truth. What makes this so powerful is that these thoughts rarely announce themselves. They slip in through familiarity. Maybe you tell yourself that you are the kind of person who always messes things up. Maybe you quietly believe that good opportunities are meant for other people. Maybe you carry an old message from someone who once made you feel small, and now your mind repeats it without questioning whether it was ever accurate. These mental echoes build your sense of self long before you ever express anything out loud. Your brain is always collecting evidence to support whatever it already believes about you. If you quietly think you are unreliable, you will remember every moment you were late and forget the countless moments you showed up. If you think you are unlovable, your mind will focus on the relationships that went wrong and overlook the people who cared deeply. The brain loves consistency, even if the story it is preserving is hurting you. It is not trying to limit you. It is trying to make sense of your world with the least resistance. And here is the twist most people do not see. Many of your deepest beliefs about yourself were formed during moments when you were too young to understand what was happening. A comment from a parent, a reaction from a teacher, a dynamic with friends, anything that made you feel less than capable. You absorbed those moments as truth because children do not analyze. They adapt. They internalize. And those internalized messages become the invisible lines that shape your adult identity. Imagine how many times you have told yourself a story about who you are without realizing it. I am the quiet one. I am the responsible one. I am the one who never gets chosen. I am the one who always has to be strong. These roles become so ingrained that you play them automatically, even in situations where they no longer make sense. They become a kind of mental gravity pulling you back into old versions of yourself. But here is the part that hits hardest. Most of these hidden thoughts are not even true. They are just familiar. They feel true because you have repeated them for so long. Your mind confuses repetition with reality. And once that happens, your identity becomes something you perform rather than something you choose. There is something freeing about catching one of these thoughts in the moment it appears. You get a sudden glimpse into the machinery behind your self-perception. Maybe you notice yourself thinking that you are bad at something before you have even tried. Maybe you hear that familiar inner voice telling you not to speak up because you will be judged. Maybe you catch that instinct to downplay your own accomplishments because you do not want to appear like you believe in yourself too much. These are not random thoughts. They are identity scripts trying to keep you within a range your mind understands. The shift begins the moment you question one of them. Not fight it. Not argue with it. Just question it. You pause and ask where this thought came from, whose voice it resembles, whether it is describing your current reality or a previous version of you. This small moment of awareness weakens the automatic power of the thought. The brain cannot cling to something that you refuse to accept blindly. Now picture what happens when you do this consistently. Your hidden thoughts begin to lose their authority. You start recognizing which ones were inherited and which ones were created by fear. You realize that confidence is not something you magically wake up with. It is something you build every time you refuse to let an old belief dictate your behavior. You start showing up differently, slightly more open, slightly more willing, slightly more aligned with who you actually want to be. And slowly the identity you once thought was fixed begins to expand. You stop living inside the limits of thoughts you never consciously chose. You become someone shaped by awareness instead of autopilot, someone who decides who they are becoming rather than repeating who they once believed they were. The silent assumptions you make about people. There is a moment when you meet someone or even just think about them, and your mind instantly fills in the blanks without asking for your permission. You do not realize you are doing it. You do not slow down and wonder whether those thoughts are true. You just assume. You assume based on tone, posture, timing, a single expression, or something vague that reminds you of a person from your past. And before you ever truly know someone, you are already responding to the version of them your mind created. These silent assumptions happen fast, almost too fast to catch. They feel like instincts, but they are really shortcuts your brain built from years of memories, experiences, and emotional patterns. Your mind believes it is protecting you. It wants to predict how people will behave so you feel a little more in control. But sometimes these predictions are based on outdated information, old wounds, or stories that never belonged to the person in front of you. Think about how quickly you decide if someone is safe or not. A stranger raises their eyebrow at you, and your mind instantly labels them as judgmental. Someone responds slowly to a message, and you quietly tell yourself they do not care. A friend cancels plans and your mind jumps straight to rejection, even though you never stop to ask whether their reasons are real or reasonable. These assumptions do not feel like guesses. They feel like facts, and that is what makes them so powerful. A lot of this comes from something psychologists call predictive thinking. The brain is always trying to save energy by recognizing patterns. If someone in your past raised their voice and it meant danger, your mind will treat any raised voice as a threat. If someone once made you feel small with a sarcastic comment, your mind will treat sarcasm as disrespect no matter who uses it. You are not reacting to the person. You are reacting to a memory disguised as a person. What makes this tricky is how invisible these assumptions are. Most of the time you do not even hear them in your mind. You only feel the reaction they create. A sudden tension, a shift in your mood, a guard coming up, a desire to pull away or defend yourself. And because the reaction feels real, you trust it. You trust it so deeply that you might treat someone based on a story they never wrote. Imagine how many misunderstandings begin this way. You think someone is uninterested, so you pull back. They sense you withdrawing, so they assume you do not want connection. Both sides operating on assumptions, neither side checking what is actually true. Or maybe you think someone is confident and unbothered, so you never realize they are struggling quietly. You assume they do not need support. You assume they are fine on their own, and they assume no one sees them. The wild part is that your assumptions are often more about who you are than who the other person is. If you fear being judged, you assume people are judging you. If you fear abandonment, you assume people are one step away from leaving. If you carry guilt from past mistakes, you assume people see you through that same lens. These are not observations. They are projections. Your mind is taking your inner world and painting it onto someone else. But here is the hopeful part. Once you start noticing these silent assumptions, you realize how much power you actually have in shaping your relationships. You begin catching those quick mental labels and asking yourself whether they are based on the person in front of you or on something old and familiar. Even a small pause can change everything. Instead of assuming someone is disinterested, you consider the possibility that they are overwhelmed. Instead of assuming someone is cold, you consider that they might be shy. Instead of assuming someone is ignoring you, you consider that their life does not revolve around your timing. This shift does not require therapy-level analysis. Every time you talk to someone, it only requires curiosity. Curiosity softens assumptions. Curiosity opens space for more accurate understanding. Curiosity lets you see people instead of predicting them. And when you practice this, your relationships become richer, calmer, more honest. You stop fighting ghosts from your past. You stop assigning motives that were never there. You begin allowing people to show you who they actually are, not who your mind decided they must be. Over time, you realize something life-changing. Most people are not trying to hurt you. Most people are not judging you. Most people are simply moving through their own fears and worries, just like you. And when you meet them without the weight of silent assumptions, connection finally has room to grow. Your unconscious response to failure. There is this moment right after something goes wrong, when you feel that uncomfortable drop in your stomach, and your mind rushes to make sense of it before you even fully understand what happened. That instant reaction, the one you barely notice, is where your unconscious response to failure lives. And for most people, that reaction is not logical at all. It is emotional. It is old. It is built from every past disappointment your brain still carries like a secret file. You would think failure triggers problem solving, but that is almost never the first thing that happens. The mind goes somewhere else entirely. Some people shrink. Some people get angry. Some people shut down. Some people pretend they do not care. These reactions feel like personality traits, but they are really protective habits formed from experiences you barely remember. Your brain tries to shield you from the pain of failure long before it tries to help you learn from it. Think about how fast it happens. One mistake, one rejection, one missed chance, and your mind races to interpret what it means about you. Maybe you hear that familiar voice say that you always mess things up, or that you should have known better, or that other people would have handled it more gracefully. You do not consciously choose these thoughts. They are stored predictions based on the times in your past when failure felt unsafe or embarrassing or heavy. Your childhood plays a bigger role in this than most people realize. If you were punished or mocked for mistakes, your brain learned to treat failure as danger. If you were expected to be perfect or impressive, your brain learned to tie failure to your worth. If you often felt compared to others, your brain learned to interpret failure as proof that you were behind. These responses become automatic, even long after your circumstances have changed. Here is the part that often goes unnoticed. The brain does not react to failure itself. It reacts to what it thinks failure means. Some people interpret it as a threat to their identity, so they spiral into overthinking. Some interpret it as a loss of control, so they get frustrated or defensive. Some interpret it as a sign that they should stop trying, so they retreat. None of these reactions are about the event. They are about meaning, and meaning is shaped by history, not reality. Imagine someone trying something new and failing immediately. One person might think that they are not good enough. Another might think they just need more practice. Another might think that everyone will judge them. The same event, completely different interpretations. And those interpretations determine how quickly or slowly someone recovers. Not skill, not intelligence, interpretation. The most painful part is when failure triggers an identity wound that you thought you had outgrown. Maybe it reminds you of not being chosen. Maybe it brings back the feeling of disappointing someone important. Maybe it activates the belief that you are only valuable when you succeed. These deep reactions often feel overwhelming because they are not about the present moment at all. They are echoes from earlier chapters of your life. But here is the freeing part. You do not need to erase your old wounds to change your unconscious response to failure. You only need to notice the pattern. Awareness interrupts the automatic spiral. When you fail, and you catch your mind rushing to a painful conclusion, you create a tiny opening. A moment where you can ask yourself if the reaction is truly about what happened, or if it is the brain replaying an old story out of habit. Picture this. Something goes wrong. For a second, your mind loads the old response. Maybe the familiar self-blame. Maybe the heavy disappointment. Maybe the urge to hide. But you pause. You breathe. You observe what your body is doing. That pause is powerful. It tells your nervous system that failure is not an emergency. It tells your identity that one setback does not define you. It tells your mind that you are not the same person who formed those old responses. When you practice this repeatedly, something subtle but profound happens. Failure stops feeling like a final verdict. It starts feeling like feedback. You begin separating who you are from what happened. You start recovering faster. You start trying more often. You stop letting old meanings control new opportunities. Over time, your unconscious response shifts from fear to resilience, from avoidance to curiosity, from shame to self-trust. You begin to see failure not as a reflection of your worth, but as a natural part of becoming someone stronger than the version of you who once believed they needed to get everything right. The self, stories you don't realize you're living by. There is a quiet story running in the background of your mind, one you rarely notice, but you live by it every single day. Not because you chose it consciously, but because it was repeated so many times in subtle ways that it eventually became the script you perform your life through. These self-stories are not dramatic. They are not spoken out loud. They are built from moments when you felt something deeply and made a private conclusion about who you are. The wild thing is that these stories often begin in childhood, long before you had the vocabulary to challenge them. Maybe someone praised you for being helpful, so you built a story that your value comes from solving everyone else's problems. Maybe you were labeled as the shy one, so you learned to stay quiet even in situations where your voice is needed. Maybe you were told you were mature for your age, so you created a story that you always have to be composed, even when you feel anything but. None of these stories were chosen. They were absorbed. As you get older, these stories become invisible guidelines. You do not say them out loud, but you feel them in the choices you make. A person who carries the story that they are always a burden will hesitate to ask for help. Someone who carries the story that they have to be strong will never allow themselves to rest. Someone who carries the story that they are difficult to love will keep people at arm's length even when they want closeness. These are not conscious decisions. They are reflexes shaped by the narrative sitting quietly in the back of your mind. The tricky part is that the brain loves consistency. Once a story is formed, your mind starts collecting evidence to support it. If your story says you are not good enough, you will replay every small mistake and forget every achievement. If your story says you are the one who holds everything together, you will focus on every moment you stayed calm and ignore all the times you were allowed to let go. You are not lying to yourself when you do this. You are trying to match your experience to the story your mind believes is true. But here is where things get complicated. Most of the stories you live by were written during moments of strong emotion, not moments of clarity. A childhood embarrassment becomes a story of being incompetent. A teenage heartbreak becomes a story of being unlovable. A moment of being ignored becomes a story of invisibility. These were emotional conclusions, not rational ones. Yet your mind clings to them because they felt true at the time, and feeling true is often enough to make something stick. Think about how many of your decisions are influenced by stories you never challenge. The story that you have to achieve to earn respect makes you overwork. The story that you must never inconvenience anyone makes you disappear into the background. The story that you always mess up makes you avoid risks that could change your life. These stories are not loud, but they are powerful. They shape your identity more than any external expectation ever could. The most surprising part is how often people repeat these stories without hearing them. You might say things like, "I am just not the type of person who takes chances," or "I always attract the wrong people," or "I am terrible at handling pressure." These lines feel like facts. They feel like personality traits. But they are really summaries of past experiences that hardened into identity. The shift begins the moment you notice one of these stories as it appears in your mind. It might happen when you are hesitating before doing something you want to do. It might happen when you feel yourself shrinking in a conversation. It might happen when you are about to dismiss a compliment because it does not match your internal script. That moment of noticing gives you a chance to question the story instead of acting it out. Imagine what happens when you step back and ask yourself whether the story is actually true today. Not 5 years ago, not in your childhood, today. Maybe you realize the story was created by someone else's expectations. Maybe you see that you have outgrown it without realizing it. Maybe you recognize that the story was never about who you were, only about how you felt in one vulnerable moment. And once you question one story, it becomes easier to question others. You start paying attention to the private lines you whisper to yourself. You start seeing which stories limit you, which ones protect you, and which ones no longer match who you are becoming. And slowly you begin writing new ones. Not through forced affirmations, but through small choices that show your mind that a different story is possible. Over time, you realize something liberating. You are not defined by the stories you inherited or the ones you formed in moments of fear. You can rewrite them. You can choose differently. You can step into a version of yourself that your old stories never made room for. And that is where your real identity begins to expand. What you notice and what you ignore. There is something almost unsettling about how your mind filters the world. You think you are seeing everything around you, but really you are only noticing the tiny slice your brain has decided matters. And the rest of reality, the parts that could inspire you or challenge you or completely change the direction of your life, slips right past without you ever realizing it. What you notice feels intentional, but it is mostly unconscious. What you ignore feels irrelevant, but it is often the very thing you need most. Your brain is always trying to manage the flood of information coming at you, and the way it does that is by building a mental playlist of what deserves your attention. But here is the catch. That playlist is built from your fears, your hopes, your insecurities, and your past experiences, not from objective truth. If you fear judgment, you notice every frown or offhand comment, and you ignore the people who appreciate you quietly. If you fear failure, you notice every obstacle, and you ignore every sign that you have handled hard things before. You think you are paying attention to reality, but you are really paying attention to the emotional magnets your brain has created over time. This is why two people can experience the same situation and walk away with completely different interpretations. One person notices every opportunity and barely registers the setbacks. Another person notices every risk and barely sees the possibilities. The world is not different. Their filters are. Your mind highlights anything that matches your existing beliefs, and it dims anything that contradicts them. It feels natural, but it is actually a form of self-protection. Your brain wants consistency more than it wants accuracy. Imagine being in a room with 20 people. If you carry a story that you are not interesting, you will notice the one person who looks distracted, and you will ignore the ones who are genuinely engaged. If you secretly believe people always leave, you will notice the friend who responds late, and you will overlook the friend who shows up without you asking. What you notice confirms your fears. What you ignore contradicts them, And because your attention is biased, your beliefs feel reinforced, even when they are completely distorted. There is a psychological principle behind this called selective attention. The brain simply cannot process everything at once, so it chooses. But it does not choose based on what is true. It chooses based on what feels familiar. Familiar thoughts, familiar emotions, familiar patterns. This is why someone who grew up around criticism becomes hyper-aware of disapproval, even when it is not there. This is why someone raised around chaos becomes attuned to anything that feels unpredictable. These patterns shape your awareness so deeply that you mistake them for reality itself. Think about how this impacts your goals. If you are used to feeling behind, you will notice every person who seems further ahead and ignore every moment of progress you have actually made. If you are used to doubting yourself, you will notice every difficulty and ignore every sign that you are capable. You end up living in a world where your potential is constantly blurred out simply because your mind was trained to look for something else. But here is the hopeful twist. You can retrain what you notice. You can shift the spotlight of your attention by becoming aware of the patterns your mind defaults to. It does not require forcing positivity or ignoring reality. It simply requires widening the frame. Imagine catching yourself in a moment where your attention is narrowing. Maybe someone gives you feedback and all you hear is the one thing you did wrong. Maybe you walk into a room and your mind immediately scans for signs of rejection. Maybe your day includes 5 good moments and 1 stressful one, and your mind replays the stressful one on loop. The moment you notice that narrowing, you gently pull your attention back and ask yourself what you are not seeing. What am I overlooking because it does not fit my old beliefs? What evidence of growth am I ignoring because it feels unfamiliar? What signal of care or support am I brushing past because I expect something different? You do not have to force the answers. Just asking the question disrupts the automatic filter. It turns on a part of your brain that sees with more clarity and less fear. Over time, this small shift changes everything. You start noticing the people who consistently show up. You start noticing the opportunities that used to blend into the background. You start noticing your own strength in situations that once overwhelmed you. And just as important, you begin ignoring the things that used to drain you. The imagined threats, the old triggers, the patterns that no longer serve your life. Your world expands or contracts based on what you notice. And the moment you take ownership of your attention, even slightly, you stop living inside the limits of your past and finally begin seeing the possibilities of your present. How you decide what's normal without thinking. There is something almost invisible about the way you decide what feels normal in your life. You do not sit down and consciously choose your standards. You do not evaluate them like a checklist. Instead, your sense of normal forms slowly, quietly, through repetition. What you see often becomes what you accept. What you tolerate becomes what you expect, and after a while, you stop noticing how much of your life is shaped by patterns you never actively chose. Think about how quickly the mind adapts. If you wake up every day to stress, that becomes normal. If your relationships feel one-sided, that becomes normal. If you stay silent to keep the peace, that becomes normal. The human brain loves familiarity so much that it will claim comfort even in discomfort, simply because discomfort is what it knows. It is not trying to trap you. It is trying to conserve energy by running the same scripts you have always run. Most of your sense of normal comes from the environment you grew up in. If emotions were avoided, you learn to treat openness as unusual. If everything was chaotic, calmness feels suspicious at first. If you were constantly overworking, rest feels unearned. Your brain anchors itself to whatever it saw most often, not whatever was healthiest. And those anchors stay with you into adulthood, shaping how you handle relationships, work, conflict, even self-worth, without you ever questioning why. What makes this so tricky is that normal rarely feels like a choice. It feels like truth. If you are used to minimizing your needs, you do not call it self-neglect. You call it being easygoing. If you are used to accepting too little, you do not call it settling. You call it being realistic. If you are used to chaos, you do not call it exhausting. You call it life. And because these patterns are so deeply woven into the fabric of your daily experience, you forget they are patterns at all. Your brain builds its definition of normal using something psychologists call automatic encoding. It stores repeated experiences as the baseline so it can navigate the world with less effort. But once something becomes your baseline, you stop noticing it. You only notice when something breaks the pattern. A person treats you with genuine respect, and it feels strange. A moment of silence feels uncomfortable. A healthy boundary feels like conflict. This is not because the new behavior is wrong. It is because your brain is comparing everything to the internal version of normal it built years ago. Imagine someone who grew up around constant criticism. They learn to expect sharpness. When someone speaks to them gently, they struggle to trust it. Or imagine someone who grew up around emotional distance. They learn to keep their guard high. Later, when someone offers real connection, it feels overwhelming. Not because the connection is bad, but because their nervous system does not recognize it as familiar. The mind clings to the predictable, even when the predictable is painful. But here is where things start to change. Normal is flexible. It can be rewritten. You do not have to stay loyal to the early version of life you absorbed. The first step is simply noticing the patterns you have been calling normal without thinking. Notice the way you talk to yourself when you make a mistake. Notice how quickly you worry about disappointing others. Notice how easily you dismiss your needs compared to someone else's. These are clues, little windows into the mental rules that have been running quietly in the background. Once you see the pattern, even briefly, you create space to question it. You begin asking whether the normal you inherited is the normal you want to keep. You start comparing your old standards to the person you are trying to become, not the person you once had to be. And that small bit of awareness is enough to begin rewriting the baseline. Picture this. You experience something healthier than what you are used to. Maybe someone listens without interrupting. Maybe someone respects your boundary. Maybe you give yourself rest without guilt. At first it might feel strange, maybe even wrong. But if you allow yourself to experience it again, and again, and again, it slowly becomes familiar. And once something becomes familiar, it becomes normal. Your definition shifts, your standards shift, your identity shifts with it. Over time, you realize normal was never fixed, it was simply repeated. And you are free to repeat something new. Your money habits on autopilot. There is this strange, almost mechanical way your mind handles money, and most of it happens without a single conscious decision. You think you are choosing how you spend, save, avoid, or chase it. But the truth is that your money habits run on autopilot far more than you realize. They were formed long before you ever earned a paycheck, and now they operate quietly in the background, shaping your financial life through patterns that feel natural only because they are familiar. Your earliest experiences with money created emotional imprints that still guide you. If you grew up around scarcity, your brain learned to treat money like a fragile resource that disappears the moment you breathe. If you grew up with unpredictability, you may overspend when you feel anxious, not because you lack discipline, but because spending gives you a temporary sense of control. If you grew up around stress, you may avoid looking at your finances entirely, because numbers became tied to fear rather than clarity. These responses are not logical. They are conditioned. What makes this so tricky is how subtle the patterns are. You tell yourself you are buying something because you want it, but sometimes you are buying because you need the emotional relief it gives you. You tell yourself you are saving because it is responsible, but sometimes you are saving because you are terrified of reliving old insecurity. You tell yourself you are broke because you mismanage money, but sometimes you are broke because your mind pushes it away the moment it arrives, as if having money feels too unfamiliar to trust. Your brain forms money habits using the same system it uses for anything tied to survival. It builds shortcuts. If money once meant stress, your nervous system reacts before your rational mind does. Your chest tightens when you open a bill. You procrastinate on budgeting because it feels overwhelming. You stick to the paycheck-to-paycheck cycle not because it is comfortable, but because it is predictable. Predictability feels safe, even when it is hurting you. And then there is the identity side of it. Many people carry quiet stories about who they think they are with money. You might believe you are bad with money, so you subconsciously act in ways that confirm it. You might believe money is always out of reach, so you do not pursue opportunities that could change your life. You might believe wealth makes people selfish, so you self-sabotage so you never become the version of a person you were taught to fear. These beliefs are not facts. They are echoes. Think about the moments when you act on impulse and only understand your behavior afterward. You promise yourself you will save. Then you overspend the moment something stressful happens. You say you want financial peace, then avoid the hard conversations about bills or debt. You want to earn more, yet you feel guilty charging what your work is worth. These contradictions are not laziness or lack of intelligence. They are emotional patterns wrapped in money decisions. But here is the part that changes everything. Your autopilot is not fixed. It is programmable. It updates the moment you bring awareness into the process. Imagine catching yourself right before you fall into an old money habit. You notice the urge to spend just to feel a little better. You notice the instinct to ignore your bank account because you are afraid of what you will find. You notice the way you hesitate to make a financial move that could help your future simply because the idea feels too big or too different. The moment you notice the pattern, even before you change it, you interrupt the automatic cycle. You give yourself a second to breathe instead of reacting. When you do this enough times, your emotional relationship with money starts to shift. You begin realizing which habits come from fear and which ones come from intention. You start separating your self-worth from your income. You stop judging yourself for every mistake and start understanding the emotional logic behind them. Money stops being a reflection of your identity and becomes a tool you can learn to manage. The turning point comes when you stop seeing money as something that controls you and start seeing it as something you can renegotiate your relationship with. You do not need to become a finance expert. You only need to understand why your autopilot behaves the way it does. Once you understand the emotional script, you can rewrite it. Over time, your habits shift from reactive to intentional. You start spending in ways that support your life instead of soothing your stress. You save because it feels empowering, not because you are scared. You make decisions based on your future instead of your past. And for the first time, you realize that your money life was never about the numbers. It was about the patterns. And patterns can be changed. The discomfort you avoid without question. There is a certain kind of discomfort that shapes your life far more than the goals you chase or the plans you make. It is the discomfort you avoid without even noticing. The things you quietly step around. The conversations you delay. The tasks you convince yourself you will get to later. The emotions you push to the side because they feel too heavy or too unclear. And what makes this kind of avoidance so powerful is that it does not feel like a decision. It feels like a tiny escape that happens almost automatically. Your brain is wired to protect you from emotional threats before it protects you from long-term consequences. If something feels overwhelming, even slightly, your mind reacts by pulling you away from it. That is how the nervous system works. It is built to push you toward whatever feels safe and pull you away from whatever feels uncertain. The problem is that discomfort and danger are not the same thing, but your brain often treats them like they are. Take something simple, like checking a bill or opening a message you have been dreading. There is a tiny spike in tension. Maybe your chest tightens or your stomach drops for half a second. Without consciously thinking, you tell yourself you will look at it later. That is your mind dodging discomfort by choosing relief over clarity, and it feels harmless, almost logical. But that small act of avoidance reinforces the belief that discomfort is something to escape from, not something you are capable of facing. This pattern shows up everywhere. You want to set a boundary, but you avoid the conversation because conflict feels unsafe. You want to start a new project, but you avoid the first step because you fear failing before you even begin. You want deeper relationships, but you avoid emotional vulnerability because it feels too exposed. None of these choices are about laziness or lack of courage. They are about your autopilot, trying to keep you far away from anything that even hints at emotional risk. Psychologists often explain this through what is called the discomfort avoidance loop. Your brain experiences a stress signal, so you step away from the source. The moment you step away, you feel relief. That relief teaches your brain that avoidance works. Next time, it repeats the same decision even faster. Before long, your life is shaped not by what you want, but by what you fear. And the wild part is how invisible this loop becomes. You do not say to yourself, "I am avoiding this because it scares me." You tell yourself you are too tired. You tell yourself it is not the right time. You tell yourself you will feel more prepared tomorrow. You build a long list of rational explanations that hide the emotional truth underneath. The avoidance becomes so familiar that you stop questioning why you do it. But here is the turning point. The moment you start noticing the specific discomfort you avoid, you begin to see the real shape of your life. Maybe you realize you always avoid tasks that involve asking for help. Maybe you notice you avoid decisions that require you to choose yourself over others. Maybe you see how often you avoid being seen, truly seen, because a part of you still worries you are not enough. These patterns tell a story, one you have been living without meaning to, Once you see the story, you can decide whether it is one you want to keep living. You do not need to bulldoze through every fear. You only need to stay present long enough to feel the discomfort without running from it. Something happens when you do that. The discomfort does not disappear, but it becomes less threatening. Your nervous system adjusts. Your mind rewrites the old narrative that says discomfort equals danger. You build new evidence that you can handle more than you thought. Imagine facing a small discomfort on purpose. You open the message. You start the conversation. You take the first step into something new. It is not about being fearless. It is about proving to your mind that fear does not have to be the final decision maker. Every time you choose presence over avoidance, you weaken the old loop and strengthen a new one. Over time, the discomfort you once avoided without question becomes the doorway to the life you actually want. Not because the discomfort fades, but because you stop letting it control your choices. You begin acting from intention instead of instinct, and in that shift, you reclaim the part of your life that was quietly being shaped by fear. The limits you set without realizing it. There is a strange moment that happens in life long before you ever try something big. You hit a wall you cannot see, a limit you never consciously set, a boundary your mind created quietly in the background. And the most surprising part is that these limits rarely feel like limits. They feel like facts. They feel like the truth of who you are. You tell yourself you are not that type of person. You tell yourself you are not ready. You tell yourself you are not capable. And you say it with so much certainty that you never stop to ask where the belief came from in the first place. Most of the limits you carry were formed years ago, long before you had the power to challenge them. You touched something uncomfortable, so your mind labeled it off limits. You failed at something once, so your brain marked it as too risky. Someone criticized you at the wrong moment, so your nervous system learned to avoid situations that might bring more embarrassment. These small experiences create emotional boundaries, not because the events were life-changing, but because your brain is always trying to protect you from repeating pain. What makes these limits so convincing is the way your mind disguises them as your personality. Instead of recognizing them as fear responses, you call them preferences. You say you are not good with people, when really you were taught that being seen is dangerous. You say you are not creative, when really you learned early on that your ideas were not welcome. You say you are not leadership material, when really you swallowed someone else's judgment and turned it into your own belief. When a limit becomes part of your identity, you stop questioning it altogether. There is a psychological mechanism called learned boundaries, where the mind builds an internal map of what feels safe and what feels unsafe based on past outcomes. The mind does not evaluate the accuracy of these conclusions. It simply locks them in. So if taking initiative once led to rejection, your brain marks initiative as risky. If speaking up once led to conflict, silence becomes the safer path. The mind updates these internal rules every time you experience something painful or uncertain. Over time, the rules become rigid, even when your life circumstances have completely changed. You can see these limits in the small moments. The way you hesitate before sending an idea because you think it is not good enough. The way you stop yourself from trying something new because you convince yourself it is too late. The way you lower your goals because aiming higher feels unrealistic. These are not logical decisions. They are emotional reflexes shaped by old patterns. And the saddest part is that many of your limits are outdated. They were created by a younger version of you. A version that did not have the confidence, the experience, the resilience, or the resources you have now. But because the emotional memory still lives in your nervous system, the limit stays in place even though you have already outgrown the fear that created it. The turning point begins the moment you recognize that the limits you feel are not the boundaries of your actual ability. They are the boundaries of your comfort zone, and comfort zones are built on repetition, not truth. When you notice the moments where you shrink, where you hesitate, where you choose the familiar instead of the meaningful, you start to see the outline of the invisible walls you have been living inside. Imagine noticing one of those limits in real time. You feel the familiar resistance. You hear the old voice that says you cannot do this, or you do not deserve that, or you are not ready for this. But instead of obeying it, you pause. You ask where it came from. You ask whether it belongs to your present or your past. You ask whether the belief is protecting you or imprisoning you. That moment of questioning is enough to weaken the limit, because limits grow strongest when they go unchallenged. You do not break these mental walls all at once. You push against them in small ways. You speak up once. You try something even when you feel unprepared. You let yourself take up a little more space than usual. Each small act expands your sense of what is possible. Your mind updates its map. The old rules lose their power. You start to see that many of the things you believed were beyond you were simply beyond your old sense of safety. Over time, the limits you once followed without thinking become choices. And once they are choices, you are free to choose differently. You outgrow the walls you never meant to live inside. You stop letting fear define your abilities, and your life begins to stretch into the space you always had, but never realized you were allowed to enter. Your default communication mode. There is a way you communicate that feels so natural you barely notice it. A default mode you slip into without thinking. It shows up in every conversation, every text, every moment when you have to express a need, a thought, or a feeling. And what makes it powerful is not the words you choose, but the automatic patterns underneath them. The tone you lean on, the way you soften yourself, the way you defend yourself, the way you hold back. These habits feel like personality traits, but most of them are emotional defense mechanisms you learned long before you ever understood communication at all. Think about how early this starts. If you grew up around people who shut down when things got emotional, you learned to communicate by staying small and careful. If you grew up around loud voices and sharp reactions, you learned to speak in a way that avoids setting off alarms. If you grew up around silence, you learned to read the room instead of expressing what you really felt. These patterns feel normal because they protected you once, and your mind, always trying to keep you safe, still uses them even when the danger is long gone. Every person has a default communication mode they slip into under stress. Some people shut down. They go quiet. They retreat into themselves because silence feels safer than being misunderstood. Some people over-explain. They pile on details to make sure no one gets upset with them. Some people become overly agreeable because being liked feels more important than being honest. Others get sharp or defensive, not because they want to fight, but because they want to shield themselves from vulnerability. None of these modes are choices in the moment. They are reflexes. There is a psychological pattern called protective messaging. where your brain crafts the safest possible communication style based on old experiences. It is like an internal algorithm that scans for threat and adjusts your tone before you can consciously decide what you actually want to say. That is why you sometimes walk away from a conversation thinking, "I did not even say what I meant." Your autopilot spoke for you. And here is the interesting part. Your default mode tends to show up strongest in the relationships that matter most. You might be clear and confident with acquaintances, but completely guarded with someone you care about. You might be expressive with friends, but emotionally distant with a partner. You might be patient with strangers, but reactive with family. It is not because you are inconsistent. It is because your communication mode is shaped by the level of emotional risk you feel, not the level of emotional intelligence you have. If you pay attention, you can see the pattern clearly. Notice how you react when someone misunderstands you. Do you shut down or do you rush to fix it? Notice what happens when someone disappoints you. Do you get quiet or do you go on the offensive? Notice how often you downplay your needs. Do you soften your message so you do not come off too demanding? These are clues, not flaws. They point to the emotional rules you internalized long ago. The moment you recognize your default mode, something shifts. You begin to see how often your communication is shaped by fear rather than intention. Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of disappointing someone, fear of being too much, fear of not being enough. These fears shape your tone more than your thoughts do. But here is the good news. Your communication style is not fixed. It can be upgraded the moment you start listening to what you are protecting yourself from. Imagine noticing yourself slipping into your usual mode. You feel yourself shrinking back, or over-explaining, or putting up walls. Instead of reacting automatically, you pause. You ask what you actually want to express. You consider what the honest version of your message would sound like if fear were not making decisions for you. You do not have to speak boldly all at once. You start with small shifts. You express one need clearly instead of wrapping it in softness. You ask one clarifying question instead of assuming the worst. You let yourself be honest even when your voice feels a little shaky. Each small step stretches your communication muscles. Your brain learns that vulnerability does not equal danger. Your nervous system adjusts. Your default mode expands into something more intentional and less protective. Over time, you become someone who communicates from clarity rather than habit. Someone who expresses instead of suppresses. Someone who listens without assuming. Someone who stands their ground without raising their guard. The old patterns do not disappear instantly, but they lose their power the moment you stop running them on autopilot. And that is the real shift. You stop speaking from the version of you who needed protection. You start speaking from the version of you who is ready to be heard. The childhood beliefs still controlling you. There are beliefs living inside you that you never agreed to, never examined, and never consciously chose. They formed when you were too young to question anything, too young to push back, too young to understand that the adults around you were passing down their own fears, their own limitations, and their own emotional wounds. And those early beliefs did not stay in childhood. They followed you. They grew with you. They shaped the way you see yourself without ever announcing their presence. Most people think their adult behavior is driven by logic, but so much of what you do is actually shaped by the rules you absorbed before you even understood what rules were. If you were praised only when you achieved something, you learned that your worth had conditions. If affection disappeared when you made a mistake, you learned that love depends on perfection. If conflict led to withdrawal or yelling, you learned that speaking up is dangerous. These lessons are not stored as memories. They become internal laws, and laws feel permanent. What makes childhood beliefs so powerful is how quietly they operate. They do not show up as thoughts like "I am unworthy" or "I am not lovable." They show up as patterns. They show up when you cannot take a compliment without deflecting it. They show up when you feel guilty for resting because you were taught productivity equals value. They show up when you shrink your voice to avoid disappointment because deep down you learned that your needs cause trouble. Your adult struggles often make perfect sense once you trace them back to the beliefs you inherited as a child. One of the strongest childhood beliefs is the belief of responsibility. If you grew up in an environment where you had to manage other people's emotions, you learned that it is your job to keep the peace. As an adult, that turns into over-explaining, over-apologizing, or over-accommodating. You start treating emotional balance like a burden you must carry, even though it was never yours in the first place. Another belief that lingers is the belief of limitation. If the people around you lived small, spoke small, dreamed small, you learned not to aim too high. You learned that wanting more is unrealistic or selfish. So now, even when opportunities appear, you hesitate. Not because you lack ability, but because a young version of you learned that dreaming big leads to disappointment. Childhood teaches you how to measure what is possible, and many people spend their entire adult lives living inside someone else's measurement. There is also the belief of visibility. If your feelings were ignored, dismissed, or mocked, you learned that being emotional is unsafe. You learned to stay quiet. You learned to hide sadness and swallow anger. You learned that expressing yourself leads to disconnection. As an adult, this becomes difficulty opening up, difficulty trusting, difficulty admitting you need help. You are not emotionally closed. You were trained to be. Psychologists often describe childhood beliefs as imprinting. The brain records patterns long before it knows how to evaluate them. A child does not think maybe my parent is overwhelmed. A child thinks I caused this. A child does not think my family struggles with communication. A child thinks my voice does not matter. Children blame themselves for everything because self-blame feels safer than believing the world is unpredictable. That self-blame often becomes the foundation of your adult belief system. But awareness is where the shift begins. When you start noticing the places in your life where your reactions feel too big, too automatic, or too familiar, you are often bumping into a childhood belief you never examined. The fear of disappointing others, the urge to minimize yourself, the instinct to avoid conflict at all costs. These reactions are not proof of your character. They are leftovers from a time when you had no control. Imagine pausing the next time you feel that old pressure to be perfect or agreeable or invincible. Instead of obeying the belief, you question it. You ask whether this belief belongs to your present self or your younger self. You ask whether it ever truly protected you, or if it simply kept you small. That small moment of questioning weakens the belief, because childhood beliefs thrive on being unquestioned. Over time, you begin rewriting the rules. You let yourself rest without guilt. You let yourself speak without rehearsing. You let yourself dream without apologizing. You let yourself exist without earning it. And slowly, the beliefs that once controlled you lose their authority. You stop living by the rules you learned as a child. You start living by the ones you choose as an adult. Your unexamined definition of success. There's a quiet voice inside you that tells you what success should look like long before you write it down. It's not the boardroom definition or a motivational poster. It's a deeply personal script you inherited from your parents, your school, your social circle, and you still follow it, maybe without even realizing. That unexamined definition of success is steering so many of your choices, and yet you barely question its origin. Think about how early you started internalizing what success means. If you grew up hearing that only top grades matter, you built a belief that success equals perfection. If you watched someone close you admire measuring value by the size of their paycheck or by how they were perceived, you absorbed the idea that worth is external. Maybe your culture praised stability and cautioned against risk. Maybe your parents worked tirelessly but still felt insecure. All these pieces seeped into your identity, shaping what success feels like, not because you chose them, but because they felt safe, familiar, expected. Here's the part that stings. That definition of success might not actually be yours. It may never have reflected what you wanted, but what someone else wanted for you. And now, you're using it as a yardstick to measure your own life, so you push yourself toward goals that don't fulfill you. You work hard in ways that drain you. You chase things that look like achievement, but feel empty when you get them. Because if you feel that something is wrong, you just assume you're not doing enough, rather than asking whether the goal itself is right for you. What's even more insidious is how this inherited idea of success hides behind your values. You'll tell yourself that you value growth, but the way you define growth comes wrapped in someone else's standard. You'll argue that you value freedom, but the path you follow is one where freedom feels like a reward for performance, not a birthright. You'll pride yourself on being independent, but you're still working to validate a definition that was coded into your brain, not built by your heart, and the values you live by reinforce it. You may avoid failure at all costs because the definition you absorbed equates failure with shame. You may stay in a job that doesn't bring you alive because success to you means climbing, not contributing. You may neglect parts of your life, your rest, your relations, your creativity, because your brain believes they are distractions, not milestones. When your inner voice defines success in a narrow way, you live your life squeezed into a shape that might not be yours. But here's the good news: you can question it. You can pause and ask, is this my version of success or someone else's? You can imagine success in a way that makes your heart lighter, not heavier. You can redefine success from a place of meaning, not pressure. Because once you name the story you are living by, you give yourself a choice about whether to keep following it. Try this. Next time you set a goal, stop for a moment and ask why. Why do you want it? What will it give you? Validation, peace, purpose, freedom. And who taught you that this is what success should feel like? When you trace it back, you might discover that some goals are rooted in fear, or reputation, or obligation, not in your own vision of a good life. That one question cracks open the story, just enough to let you decide whether to stay on that path or chart a new one. Over time, redefining success changes everything. You stop chasing outcomes that drain you. You start forging a definition that feels deeply yours. You learn to celebrate progress, not just arrival. You grow not just in external marks, but in internal alignment. And suddenly, success becomes more than something you achieve. It becomes the way you live. When you actively rewrite your definition of success, you reclaim your direction. You stop letting old voices tell you what your life is supposed to look like. Instead, you build a version of success that reflects the person you are, the values you carry, and the story you want to tell. And that, more than anything, is the success you actually deserve. How past fears predict your future. There is a way your past fears reach into your future long before you ever make a decision. They do not show up with flashing lights. They do not introduce themselves. They simply slip into your choices, your reactions, your expectations, and you start living as if they are still true. The fear itself may be old, but the pattern it creates is very current, and unless you look closely, you might never realize that the life you are building is still being shaped by what once scared you. Past fears stick to the nervous system. Your mind learns quickly what hurts and what feels risky. It remembers the moments when you felt rejected, embarrassed, unseen, or powerless. It remembers the situations that made you feel small, overwhelmed, or out of control. And even though you moved on, your brain stores those memories as warnings. It uses them like a map. So when you face something that even vaguely resembles an old threat, your body reacts first. Your logic arrives late. This is why some people avoid opportunities that look nothing like the situations they struggled with in the past, yet the emotional reaction feels identical. A chance to lead reminds you of a moment when your confidence was crushed. A new relationship triggers the fear of losing yourself again. A new path brings back the dread of failing publicly. You are not reacting to the present moment. You are reacting to the emotional residue of the past. There is a psychological principle called pattern prediction. Your brain predicts future danger based on earlier experiences, even when the connection makes no logical sense. If you once faced criticism when you tried something new, your brain labels anything unfamiliar as risky. If you once felt abandoned, your brain assumes closeness always comes with a hidden expiration date. If you once felt powerless, your brain tells you not to chase anything that might put you in a vulnerable position again. The fear becomes a forecast, and forecasts shape decisions. What makes this so powerful is that past fears show up quietly in the form of habits. You might always choose the safe option, not because you lack ambition, but because your system is trying to avoid an old kind of pain. You might stay in situations that feel familiar but limiting, because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty. You might sabotage good things the moment they appear, not because you want to, but because your nervous system is trying to protect you from the possibility of losing them. And these fears often disguise themselves as logic. You tell yourself you are being practical. You tell yourself you are being realistic. You tell yourself you are avoiding disappointment. But underneath those explanations is a younger version of you who was overwhelmed once and is trying desperately to avoid being overwhelmed again. The fear that shaped you is still guiding your steps, even when your adult mind wants something different. But there is a turning point, and it begins with noticing. The moment you ask yourself why you avoid certain actions or why certain situations feel heavier than they should, you often discover a fear you never resolved. Maybe you realize you avoid speaking up because you learned early on that your voice caused conflict. Maybe you avoid dreaming bigger because you once faced ridicule for wanting more. Maybe you avoid emotional closeness because you were hurt at a time when you were unprepared to handle it. These are not personal flaws. They are emotional echoes. Imagine catching the fear in real time. You feel resistance before a new opportunity. You feel hesitation before a conversation that matters. You feel the impulse to shrink, retreat, or rush toward comfort. Instead of assuming those reactions are meaningful, you pause. You ask whether the fear belongs to the present or the past. You ask whether the person you are today is still as fragile as the person who first experienced that fear. That pause is where everything shifts. Your brain updates itself through experience. When you allow yourself to face something that once scared you, even in a small way, you create a new pattern. You prove to your system that the danger is no longer there. You build evidence that the old fear does not predict your future anymore. The more evidence you gather, the less control the fear holds. Over time, the grip of the past loosens. You start choosing based on desire instead of avoidance. You start trusting your voice because it no longer carries the weight of old tension. You start stepping toward things you used to run from because those experiences no longer remind you of the person you once were. The future begins to feel wider, more open, more yours. Your past fears shaped your path only as long as you walked without awareness. Once you see where those fears came from, you free yourself to build a future that is not a reaction to old pain, but a reflection of who you have become. Judgments that reveal more about you than others. There is a strange truth about the judgments you make of other people. You think you are evaluating them, measuring their behavior, forming opinions about who they are. But most of the time, your judgments reveal far more about your inner world than theirs. They expose your insecurities, your fears, your values, your unmet needs, your old wounds. They act like mirrors, not verdicts. And because the process feels automatic, you rarely notice what your reactions are saying about you. It starts with the way your brain categorizes people. You are constantly scanning for signs of safety, threat, similarity, or difference. You do this without thinking. If someone talks too loudly, your mind may label them as too much because you were taught that being loud attracts trouble. If someone seems calm and detached, you may label them uncaring because you grew up equating emotional distance with rejection. If someone takes up space with confidence, you may call them arrogant because a part of you wishes you had permission to do the same. The judgment is aimed outward, but the meaning is inward. Judgments often reflect the parts of yourself you have not made peace with. When you criticize someone for being indecisive, it may be because you fear your own hesitation. When you judge someone for showing off, it may be because you feel unseen. When you roll your eyes at someone setting a boundary, it may be because you struggle to set your own. Your mind reacts strongly when someone's behavior touches a part of you that feels unresolved. There is a concept in psychology called projection, but it is often misunderstood. It does not mean you are guilty of every flaw you notice. It means your mind pays extra attention to traits that connect with your emotional history. The things you judge intensely are usually things you have wrestled with or avoided. Someone else's confidence activates your insecurity. Someone else's vulnerability activates your discomfort with your own emotions. Someone else's ambition activates the part of you that wonders whether you settled too early. Your reactions are clues to the stories you carry. Judgments also reveal your hidden fears. If you judge people who fail, it may be because you fear failure in yourself. If you judge people who move slowly, it may be because stillness makes you anxious. If you judge people who take risks, It may be because you worry that you missed yours. When a judgment feels charged, there is almost always a fear underneath it. And if you look closely, the intensity of your reaction rarely matches the behavior in front of you. It matches the weight of the fear behind it. Another layer of judgment comes from the rules you were taught growing up. If you were raised in a home where emotions were seen as weakness, you might judge people who cry or express sadness. If you were taught that hard work is the only path to respect, you might judge people who rest or move at their own pace. If you were taught that stability matters above all else, you might judge anyone who chooses an unconventional path. These judgments are less about the person in front of you and more about the rules your childhood imprinted on you. But here is where things start to shift. Instead of treating your judgments like truths, you can treat them like signals. Each reaction is a small message from your inner world. Maybe the judgment points to a part of you that still feels insecure. Maybe it points to a desire you never explored. Maybe it points to a wound you have not healed. The judgment becomes an invitation to understand yourself more deeply. Imagine catching yourself mid-judgment. You see someone acting boldly and your mind reacts. Instead of clinging to the judgment, you ask yourself what it brings up in you. Do you feel envy, longing, fear, discomfort? Do you wish you had the courage to do the same? Or does the behavior remind you of something painful from your past? When you ask these questions, the judgment loses its grip because it is no longer about them. It becomes a mirror that shows you what you need to address. This kind of awareness softens you, not just toward others, but toward yourself. You begin recognizing that judgment is rarely about bad people or good people. It is about emotional patterns running under the surface. When you understand the pattern, compassion naturally grows. You see others more clearly. You understand yourself more honestly. Over time, the judgments that once felt automatic become opportunities for growth. You learn to replace reaction with curiosity. You learn to question the stories behind your assumptions. And slowly, you build a life guided not by unconscious triggers, but by conscious understanding. Your judgments stop being weapons or shields. They become windows. And through those windows, you finally see yourself. Why you choose familiar partners and patterns. There is a moment in every relationship where something feels oddly familiar. You might not say it out loud, but you notice it. A tone of voice, a pattern of attention, a rhythm of closeness and distance. It feels natural, almost comforting, even if it is not healthy. And before you realize it, you are drawn toward the same types of people, the same emotional dynamics, the same cycles that appeared in past relationships. It is not because you enjoy the repetition. It is because familiarity feels safer to your nervous system than the unknown. Your mind is always scanning for what it recognizes. From childhood through early adulthood, you learn what love feels like, what conflict looks like, what attention means, and what emotional safety sounds like. These lessons do not remain in the past. They imprint themselves onto your instincts. So when you meet someone new, you are not just responding to who they are. You are responding to the emotional pattern they activate in you. It feels like chemistry, but often it is memory. People underestimate how much predictability matters to the brain. Your nervous system is designed to choose what feels known, not necessarily what feels good. If love once came with inconsistency, you may unconsciously associate inconsistency with passion. If affection came with tension, you may associate tension with connection. If comfort was tied to caretaking, You may feel drawn to people who need rescuing. The mind often confuses emotional familiarity with emotional truth. This is why someone genuinely healthy can feel confusing or even boring at first. Your system does not know how to interpret stability if it never received it. It does not know how to trust gentleness if you learn that love requires earning. It does not know how to relax around someone who does not trigger your old patterns. Your brain is not rejecting the person. It is rejecting the unfamiliar emotional landscape because it cannot predict it. There is a psychological mechanism called repetition compulsion, which sounds dramatic but is deeply human. It describes the tendency to repeat old emotional scenarios in an attempt to resolve them. Your mind brings you back toward situations that echo your past, hoping you will finally create a different ending. The problem is that you often choose the same emotional role you played before. If you grew up being the peacemaker, you may choose partners who create conflict. If you grew up feeling unseen, you may choose partners who offer just enough affection to keep you chasing. The pattern feels like a chance for redemption, but it keeps you trapped in the same emotional loop. And familiarity does not only shape who you choose. It shapes how you behave once you are there. If you learn that expressing needs leads to rejection, you may suppress your needs even with someone who is willing to meet them. If you learn that love fades when you relax, you may stay hyper-aware, constantly scanning for signs of withdrawal. If you learn that relationships demand sacrifice, you may overgive until you feel empty and misunderstood. The pattern is internal long before it is relational. But here is the turning point. Patterns become visible when something finally feels off. You realize that you are repeating dynamics that do not match the person you want to become. You catch yourself reacting out of habit instead of intention. You notice that the emotional pull you mistake for chemistry is just your nervous system chasing what it knows. This awareness is uncomfortable, but it is powerful. It allows you to step out of the automatic loop. Imagine meeting someone new and listening not to the spark, but to the feeling underneath it. Does your body feel tight or calm? Are you drawn to them because they feel safe or because they feel familiar? Does the excitement feel like curiosity or anxiety? These subtle differences change everything. They help you distinguish between connection and compulsion. Breaking old patterns is not about finding the perfect partner. It is about becoming aware of the emotional signature you keep seeking. Once you recognize that familiarity is not the same as compatibility, you open space for different choices. You become slower to rush, quicker to observe, more willing to question the story your nervous system is pushing you toward. You learn to value partners who make your life easier, not your fears louder. Over time, what once felt unfamiliar begins to feel grounding. Healthy becomes natural. Calm becomes interesting. Safety becomes attractive. And the familiar patterns that once ran your relationships quietly lose their grip. You stop choosing partners based on old wounds. You start choosing based on the future you want. Your automatic response to opportunity. There is a moment that happens before you ever accept or reject an opportunity. It is fast, almost invisible. You feel a pull or a pause, a spark or a tightening. Your whole body reacts before your mind forms a single thought. That automatic response decides far more about your life than the opportunity itself. Most people think they turn things down because they are too busy or not ready or being realistic. But underneath the explanation is a reflex that was built long before the opportunity arrived. Your mind has two systems running at the same time. One is the part of you that dreams and imagines and gets excited about new paths. The other is the part that tries to keep you safe by predicting danger. The second system always moves faster. It is scanning for anything unfamiliar and labeling it as risky. When something new shows up, your nervous system reacts like you just stepped toward the edge of a cliff. Even if the opportunity is good, your body might tighten. Your breathing might shift. You might feel hesitation that you cannot explain. This is not lack of ambition. It is your brain using old data to protect you. Think about the first reaction you had the last time something promising came your way. Maybe someone offered you a chance to lead, and you immediately felt the weight of responsibility instead of the excitement of recognition. Maybe someone invited you to collaborate, and you instantly imagined everything that could go wrong. Maybe you had an idea you wanted to pursue, and as soon as you felt energy rising, your brain shut it down with a quiet sense of no, not now. These snap reactions were shaped by years of conditioning, not the reality of the moment. Your automatic response to opportunity usually comes from three places. The first is fear of failure. If you have ever felt embarrassed, overwhelmed, or judged for trying something new, your mind will try to protect you from that feeling by shrinking your choices. It will whisper that you are not ready, even when you are more prepared than ever. The second source is fear of outgrowing your current world. Opportunities often require transformation, and transformation disrupts comfort. Even positive change can feel like loss. You worry about leaving people behind, shifting your routine, or stepping into an identity that feels too big. You might reject the opportunity, not because it is wrong for you, but because it threatens the version of yourself you are attached to. The third source is self-concept. If you were raised to be the quiet one, the helper, the dependable one, the background character, major opportunities clash with that identity. You might feel an odd discomfort at the idea of being seen, supported, or chosen. Your old identity says stay small. The opportunity says expand. And the internal conflict makes the opportunity feel heavier than it is. But awareness changes everything. When you slow down and notice the automatic reaction, you create space to question it. You realize that the first feeling is not a verdict. It is just your system warning you that something unfamiliar is happening. You can pause and ask a different set of questions. Does this opportunity align with who I want to become? Am I resisting because it is wrong or because it is new? Is this fear guiding me or limiting me? The moment you ask these questions, your brain shifts from protection mode to exploration mode. Opportunities often come disguised as discomfort. The job that stretches you, the idea that feels too big, the invitation that pushes you into growth, the new direction that forces you to release an old version of yourself. If you judge opportunities by how comfortable they feel, you will turn down the moments that were meant to change you. It helps to remember that your nervous system updates itself through experience. If you take small steps toward what scares you, your brain learns that the unknown is not always dangerous. You build tolerance. You build courage. You build a new baseline for what is normal. That means the next opportunity will feel less intimidating, and the one after that will feel more natural. Eventually, the automatic response that once held you back becomes a signal that you are moving towards something meaningful. Over time, you stop letting reflexes make your decisions. You stop shrinking before life expands. You stop waiting to feel ready and start allowing readiness to grow through action. The opportunities that once felt too big start feeling like the next logical step because you no longer measure your future by your past reactions. Your automatic response does not have to choose your path. Once you understand it, you reclaim the ability to choose for yourself. The inner rules you follow without knowing why. There are rules you follow every single day that you never consciously agreed to. They sit deep in your mind like quiet instructions, shaping what you allow, what you avoid, how you speak, how you work, and how you move through the world. You do not remember learning these rules because most of them were absorbed, not taught. They came from childhood, from culture, from moments when you felt rewarded or punished, from people you wanted to please, and from experiences that pushed you into survival mode. These rules feel natural, almost obvious, even though they were never chosen, and because you rarely question them, they end up directing huge parts of your life. You can see these inner rules when you look at the way you handle small decisions. You might tell yourself that you must always be productive or you lose your worth. You might believe you must stay agreeable or conflict will explode. You might feel that you need to handle everything alone because relying on others creates risk. None of these rules are universal truths. They are emotional conclusions you formed at some earlier point in life when you were trying to stay safe. But over time, they hardened into unconscious expectations that now guide how you behave. Many inner rules begin with a simple emotional memory. If you were praised for being quiet, you may follow the rule that speaking up is dangerous. If you were only noticed when you excelled, you may carry the rule that rest equals failure. If you were criticized for making mistakes, you may live by the rule that everything must be perfect. These rules start as protection. They help you avoid rejection, embarrassment, or discomfort. But as you grow, the rules remain fixed, even when the situations that created them have long passed. Another layer of inner rules comes from the roles you were given early in life. Maybe you were the reliable one who handled everything. Maybe you were the peacekeeper who soothed tension. Maybe you were the achiever who carried the expectations of others. Whatever role you played became a guiding rule. Be strong. Do not be a burden. Keep the peace. Do not disappoint. These roles followed you into adulthood because they once made you feel accepted or at least less vulnerable. And then there are the rules shaped by scarcity. If you grew up feeling that attention was limited, you may carry the rule that you must not ask for too much. If opportunities felt rare, you may follow the rule that taking risks is irresponsible. If love felt unpredictable, you may live by the rule that you must control everything to avoid getting hurt. These rules do not sound like rules in your mind. They sound like common sense. But when you look closer, you realize they are habits of protection, not habits of truth. You can spot these rules by noticing the moments where you feel an internal no before you even think. The moment you want to rest but feel guilty. The moment you want to speak up but feel like you should stay small. The moment you want to try something new but hear an internal voice saying people like you do not do that. These are the rules revealing themselves. They show up as discomfort, hesitation, or internal pressure. And once you notice them, you start to see how deeply they have shaped your decisions. But here is the shift. These rules are not fixed. The brain created them through repetition, and the brain can rewrite them through awareness. When you pause and ask where a rule came from, you begin to separate your identity from your conditioning. You start to realize that the rule was formed by a younger version of you, someone who needed structure or safety in a moment when life felt overwhelming. You can appreciate that version of yourself without letting those outdated rules continue to run your adult life. Imagine questioning one of your rules in real time. You feel guilty for resting. Instead of obeying the guilt, you ask why. Did someone teach you that doing nothing makes you lazy? Did your worth become tied to productivity because it made you feel safe? When you look at the origins of the rule loses its authority. You begin to see that your guilt is not a moral signal. It is an old pattern. As you challenge these rules, something powerful happens. You create space for new ones. Rules that reflect your current goals, not your old fears. Rules that support your well-being, not your survival. Rules that open your world instead of shrinking it. Slowly, you stop living by rules you never agreed to. You begin living by choices you finally understand. The comparisons you make without notice. There is a moment your mind compares you to someone else before you even realize it happened. You see a person succeeding or struggling or celebrating or simply existing differently than you, and your brain makes a quiet measurement. It is fast, instinctive, and often invisible. Most of the time you do not even notice the comparison. You only notice the feeling it leaves behind. A sudden dip in confidence, a rush of pressure, a strange sense of urgency, or sometimes a burst of superiority that fades as quickly as it appeared. These small comparisons shape your decisions far more than you think. The mind compares as a way to understand where you fit in the world. It is an old survival mechanism. Long before modern life, knowing your position in a group helped you stay safe. Today, that instinct has not disappeared. It simply adapted to your environment. You compare your pace, your progress, your relationships, your appearance, your achievements, and even your struggles to the people around you. The comparison is not intentional. It is automatic. But the meaning you attach to it changes everything. Most comparisons come from an internal scale you did not build consciously. You judge yourself based on the values you absorbed when you were younger. If you were praised for being responsible, you compare yourself to people who look more accomplished. If you were celebrated for being attractive, you compare yourself to people who fit the standards you were taught to chase. If you grew up feeling unseen, you compare your visibility to that of others. Every comparison has a root, and the root usually comes from a moment when you were taught what mattered. And here is the part people overlook. You rarely compare yourself to others in areas you feel secure. The comparisons that sting the most reveal the insecurities you have not addressed. If you feel unsure about your career, you notice the success of others instantly. If you feel uncertain about your relationships, you notice when others look happy and connected. If you are wrestling with your identity, you notice people who seem confident and grounded. The comparison points directly to the part of you that feels unresolved. There is also the comparison that happens in the opposite direction. When you see someone struggle and you feel a momentary lift, it does not make you unkind. It simply means your mind is scanning for signs that you are doing enough. When you feel behind, you try to find evidence that you are not failing. That is not cruelty. It is fear. It is the quiet fear of not measuring up, not being worthy, not being on the right path. The comparison reveals the insecurity, not the truth. Another hidden force behind comparison is identity protection. Your mind holds a story about who you are, and it carefully watches the world for anything that challenges that story. If you think of yourself as the reliable one, you compare yourself to those who seem irresponsible. If you think of yourself as the underdog, you compare yourself to those born with privilege. If you think of yourself as the outsider, you compare yourself to people who fit in easily. These comparisons are not about accuracy. They are about maintaining a familiar emotional identity. But the real power comes from noticing the comparison instead of getting pulled into it. When you catch yourself feeling discouraged or pressured after seeing someone else, you can pause and ask what part of you felt threatened. Was it your self-worth, your pace, your sense of possibility, your fear of being left behind? Once you ask the question, the comparison loses its ability to define you. It becomes information instead of judgment. Imagine noticing a comparison and treating it like a clue. You see someone thriving. Instead of shrinking, you ask what that reaction says about your desires. Maybe the comparison shows you what you secretly want. Maybe it reveals a dream you buried. Maybe it highlights a standard you inherited but no longer believe in. Comparison becomes a mirror reflecting the direction you need to grow, not a verdict on your value. You can also reframe comparison as evidence that your mind is waking up. The only reason you notice someone ahead of you is because you are moving in a similar direction. You only compare paths that matter to you. So the sting of comparison is really a sign that your potential is being activated, not threatened. Over time, when you stop letting comparisons define your worth, they begin to guide your clarity. You learn to separate admiration from inadequacy. You learn to see someone else's success as possibility, not proof that you are behind. You learn to let other people's achievements remind you that your story is still unfolding. The comparisons you make without notice do not have to shrink you. They can show you exactly where to grow next. Your reflex reaction to criticism. There is a split second after someone criticizes you when your whole system reacts before your mind has a chance to think. Your chest tightens, your thoughts speed up, or your face goes warm. You might shut down. You might fire back. You might explain yourself too quickly. Or you might pretend nothing happened while your stomach twists. This reflexive reaction tells you far more about your history than the criticism itself. It is automatic, deeply learned, and usually invisible unless you slow down enough to notice it. Most people think they fear criticism because it threatens their ego, but the truth runs deeper. Your reaction to criticism is often shaped by the emotional environment you grew up in. If your mistakes were treated as failures, you learn to panic when someone points out a flaw. If your feelings were dismissed, you learned that criticism equals rejection. If approval was unpredictable, you learn to scramble for validation the moment it feels like you might lose it. Your body reacts to criticism the way it reacted years ago, even if the situation today is completely different. This is why even gentle feedback can feel like an attack. Your system does not distinguish between a thoughtful suggestion and a harsh judgment. It scans for danger. It hears a correction and thinks you are in trouble. It hears a concern and thinks you are disappointing someone. It hears an observation and thinks your worth is slipping. The reaction is not logical, it is protective. Your mind learned that criticism meant vulnerability, so it tries to shield you the moment it detects anything that resembles it. Different people have different reflexes. Some people react with defensiveness. They explain, justify, or deny because that reaction once kept them safe from blame. Others react with overcompliance. They apologize too quickly or try to fix everything at once because they learned that harmony must be restored immediately. Some people shut down entirely. They go quiet, numb, or disconnected because that was the safest response when they were younger. None of these reactions are personality traits. They are survival strategies disguised as habits. Criticism also triggers identity. If you define yourself as responsible, criticism about your reliability feels like a personal attack. If you define yourself as kind, criticism about your tone feels devastating. If you define yourself as capable, criticism about your work triggers panic. Your mind hears the feedback as a threat to the role you have spent years protecting. And because you built worth around that identity, any challenge to it feels destabilizing. But here is where things start to shift. Your reflex reaction is not wrong. It is outdated. It is trying to protect you from a danger that no longer exists. When you pause and observe the reaction instead of obeying it, everything changes. You can separate the feeling from the meaning. The feeling may say you are unsafe. The meaning might be nothing more than someone offering a perspective. Imagine this happening in real time. Someone gives you feedback, and you feel your body react. Instead of defending yourself or shrinking, you pause. You notice the physical sensation. You name the instinct. Maybe your chest tightened because you fear disappointing people. Maybe your mind raced because you learned to avoid blame at all costs. Maybe you felt numb because conflict has always overwhelmed you. That moment of awareness keeps the reflex from choosing your response for you. Once you recognize the pattern, criticism becomes easier to handle because it loses its old emotional weight. You start hearing feedback as information instead of judgment. You begin to separate your worth from your performance. You become less controlled by the need to be perfect because you no longer fear what imperfection means about you. And when a piece of criticism is unfair or unkind, you are better equipped to see that clearly instead of internalizing it. Another powerful shift happens when you ask yourself what the criticism threatens. Does it threaten your identity? Your desire to be seen as good? Your fear of being misunderstood? Your old need for approval? When you identify the threat, you often realize the criticism itself matters far less than the old wound it activated. Over time, your reaction softens. You stop spiraling. You stop over-explaining. You stop shutting down. You stop carrying every comment like evidence against you. You start responding with clarity, not fear. And in that shift, criticism becomes less of a threat and more of a tool you can use or ignore depending on its quality. Your reflex reaction to criticism once kept you safe. Now it can become the doorway to understanding yourself more deeply. The expectations you think others have of you. There is a strange pressure you carry every day, and most of it does not come from other people at all. It comes from the expectations you think they have of you. These expectations feel real, heavy, and urgent, even though many of them were never spoken. You assume people need you to be a certain way. You assume they will be disappointed if you change. You assume they are watching, evaluating, waiting for you to meet a standard you never actually agreed to. And without noticing it, you begin shaping your entire life around these imagined demands. It often starts early. Maybe you were praised for being responsible, so you assumed you always had to be dependable. Maybe you were admired for being strong, so you decided you were not allowed to fall apart. Maybe you were valued for being helpful, so you convinced yourself that saying no would make you selfish. Over time, these assumptions become internal rules. You tell yourself that everyone expects you to work harder, care more, show up perfectly, and carry the weight without complaint. But if someone asked you directly who told you these expectations exist, you would not have an answer. They simply feel true. Your mind builds these expectations from small moments. A parent sighs when you make a mistake, and you assume people expect you never to fail. A teacher praises your effort, and you assume people expect you to over-deliver. A friend calls you the stable one, and you assume people expect you to hold everything together. You absorb these cues without questioning them, and before long, the imagined expectations feel more powerful than the real ones. The most surprising part is how often these expectations come from your own fears. When you believe people expect you to succeed nonstop, what you really fear is being seen as inadequate. When you believe people expect you to always be calm, what you really fear is being judged for showing emotion. When you believe people expect you to never change paths, what you really fear is disappointing those whose approval you once needed. The expectation feels external, but the fear behind it is entirely internal. And this creates a quiet exhaustion. You wake up feeling like you are already behind. You think you owe people more than they ever asked for. You say yes because you worry that a single no will change how they see you. You hide your confusion because you assume people expect you to have it all figured out. You push through burnout because you assume people rely on you more than they actually do. You live in a constant loop of trying to match expectations that no one ever confirmed. These imagined expectations also shape your choices. You may stay in a role that drains you because you believe others expect you to be the reliable one. You may hold back from trying something new because you believe others expect you to stay predictable. You may avoid setting boundaries because you believe others expect you to remain endlessly available. The fear of disappointing someone, even when you cannot name who that someone is, keeps you from making decisions that honor your real needs. But there is a moment when all of this starts to unravel. It happens when you finally question the expectation instead of blindly following it. You pause and ask yourself, who actually expects this from me? Did anyone truly say I must be perfect? Did anyone tell me I cannot change? Did anyone demand that I carry this much? Most of the time the answer is no. And even when the answer is yes, you realize the cost of meeting that expectation is far higher than the cost of releasing it. Imagine catching yourself in the middle of that instinct. You feel pressure to say yes, and you pause. You feel responsible for someone else's feelings, and you pause. You feel afraid to disappoint, and again, you pause. In that pause, you recognize that the pressure does not come from reality. It comes from the meaning you have assigned to approval. It comes from old roles, old fears, and old habits. When you begin challenging these imagined expectations, you create space for a different life. You realize that most people think far less about your choices than you assumed. You realize the people who truly care about you want your well-being more than your performance. You realize that the expectations you feared were often projections of your own insecurities. And instead of living for an invisible audience, you begin choosing based on what feels honest, sustainable, and aligned with who you are becoming. Slowly, the weight lifts. You stop performing and start living. You stop striving for approval you never needed. You stop molding yourself into a version that keeps everyone comfortable but leaves you shrinking. The expectations you thought others had of you lose their power the moment you realize they were never in control. How you decide what you deserve, unconsciously. There is a moment deep inside you where you quietly decide what you deserve. You do not say it out loud. You do not write it down. You do not even think it consciously. But the belief is there, shaping every choice you make. It influences the opportunities you reach for, the relationships you pursue, the treatment you tolerate, and the goals you talk yourself out of. You think you are making decisions based on logic or personality, but most of the time you are acting according to an internal limit you never chose. This inner sense of deservingness is built slowly. It comes from the way people responded to you when you were young. If you were celebrated, you learned that good things are meant for you. If you were ignored, you learned that asking for more is risky. If affection required earning, you learned that love must be worked for. These early experiences form an emotional blueprint that tells you what is normal for someone like you. And the blueprint becomes automatic. You stop questioning it because it feels like truth. Your mind adopts these beliefs long before you have the ability to challenge them. Maybe you grew up in a home where comfort was scarce, so you learned to expect very little from life. Maybe you were surrounded by people who downplayed your achievements, so you learned that success belongs to others. Maybe you absorbed the silent message that your needs are secondary, so you learned to settle for the leftovers. None of these beliefs feel like beliefs. They feel like the natural order of things. You can see this blueprint in small moments. When someone compliments you, do you accept it or brush it off? When an opportunity appears, do you lean toward it or assume someone else deserves it more? When a relationship feels healthy, do you relax into it or wait for it to fall apart? These reactions are not random. They reflect the worth you assigned yourself long ago. One of the strangest things about deservingness is that your brain looks for evidence to confirm whatever story it already believes. If you unconsciously think you deserve less, you notice rejection more than acceptance. You notice mistakes more than progress. You remember the times you were overlooked and forget the moments when you were chosen. Your mind filters the world to match the narrative it already trusts. This shapes your behavior in subtle but powerful ways. You stop applying for things that stretch you. You choose partners who treat you exactly as your old story predicted. You downplay your strengths because standing out feels uncomfortable. You settle for what is available instead of pursuing what you want. You do not do these things because you lack desire. You do them because your internal blueprint whispers that trying for more will only lead to disappointment. There is also a hidden layer of fear inside all of this. Wanting more means risking loss. Believing you deserve better means confronting the possibility that you might not get it. So your mind protects you by shrinking your expectations. It tells you to be grateful for what you have, even when what you have is quietly draining you. It tells you not to reach too high because falling from a higher place hurts more. It tells you to stay small so you can stay safe. But the moment you begin questioning what you believe you deserve, everything shifts. You start noticing the parts of your life where you settled out of habit, not choice. You see the patterns in your relationships, your work, your boundaries, your ambitions. You begin recognizing the old voice that says, "Do not bother, do not try, do not ask." That voice is not your truth, it is your conditioning. Imagine catching that voice as it appears. You feel yourself shrinking back from an opportunity, and you pause. You feel yourself apologizing for taking up space, and you pause. You feel yourself lowering your expectations without thinking, and again, you pause. In that pause, you can ask a better question. Not do I deserve this based on my past, but do I deserve this based on who I am becoming? Your sense of deservingness grows every time you act slightly above your old identity. Every time you ask for what you need. Every time you refuse what once felt normal. Every time you choose connection over self-doubt. The blueprint updates itself slowly through repeated experiences that contradict the old story. Over time, you stop deciding what you deserve based on fear, memory, or survival. You begin deciding based on vision. And that single shift changes the entire direction of your life. The biases guiding your decisions. There is a quiet force steering you long before you ever make a choice. It slips in beneath your thoughts, nudges your attention in certain directions, and makes some options feel right while others feel wrong, even when you cannot explain why. These are the biases guiding your decisions. And the tricky part is that they do not feel like biases. They feel like instincts, common sense, or just your personality. But underneath all of that is a hidden pattern shaping your life without asking for permission. You see it in the way your mind jumps to conclusions before you even realize you are thinking. You walk into a room, glance at someone for half a second, and your brain quietly decides how trustworthy they seem. You hear a familiar idea, and you instantly feel more comfortable with it because your brain loves whatever it recognizes. You stick with a job, a routine, or a belief simply because it has existed in your life long enough to feel safe. The consistency feels logical, but it is really your mind favoring the familiar over the unknown. One of the strongest biases hiding in the background is the confirmation bias. It is the way your brain tries to prove itself right while pretending it is being objective. If you believe you are unlucky, you notice every setback and overlook every win. If you think a person dislikes you, you notice their distance and ignore their warmth. Your attention bends toward whatever reinforces your story. It is not that you cannot see the full picture. It is that your mind highlights only the parts that match your expectations. There is also the status quo bias, which is the reason change feels heavier than staying the same. Your brain is wired to conserve energy, and change demands energy. Uncertainty feels risky even when your current situation is quietly suffocating you. So you delay decisions, stick with old habits, and tell yourself you will make a move when things feel clearer. But clarity rarely arrives on its own. Comfort just disguises itself as logic. Then there is the halo effect. You meet someone who is confident, and suddenly you assume they are also kind or intelligent or trustworthy. You see one positive trait, and your brain fills in the rest, as if it is coloring in a shape it wants to be complete. The same thing happens in reverse with the horn effect, where a single negative detail makes everything else look darker than it really is. You think you are seeing the whole person, but you are reacting to the first impression your brain was too quick to form. Another hidden bias shows up in the way you judge possibilities. It is called availability bias. Your mind relies on whatever information is easiest to recall, not what is most accurate. If you heard one story about someone failing, you might think your own chances are lower. If you saw one situation go bad, your brain treats it as common. Your decisions become shaped by what is memorable rather than what is true. But the most personal bias, and the one that shapes your life more than any other, is the self-serving bias. It protects your self-image by assigning meaning to your experiences in ways that feel flattering or safe. When something goes wrong, you blame the circumstance. When something goes right, you credit your effort. At first, this sounds empowering, but it becomes a quiet trap. Because when you shield yourself from uncomfortable truths, you also shield yourself from growth. Your brain is trying to protect you from pain, but in the process, it keeps you from seeing the patterns you actually need to change. These biases are not flaws. They are shortcuts your brain built to help you process the world faster. But when you rely on shortcuts without noticing them, they pull you toward decisions that feel automatic instead of intentional. They make you defend opinions you never questioned. They make you trust your first instinct even when your instinct is based on outdated experiences. They make you assume your perspective is reality when it is really just a reflection of your past. The moment things begin to shift is the moment you notice the bias as it appears. You catch yourself assuming, and you pause. You feel that flicker of certainty, and you pause. You realize your reaction is too fast, too familiar, too comfortable, and again, you pause. That pause is where your freedom begins. Because in that space you can choose to see more than your brain's first impression. You do not need to eliminate your biases. You only need to become aware of them. Awareness gives you a second choice, one that is not shaped by fear, familiarity, or old wiring. And that is how you slowly reclaim the decisions that were never truly yours until now. Your go-to coping mechanisms. There is always a moment you do not notice, a tiny flicker of discomfort that appears in your body before your mind has a chance to process what is happening. And almost instantly, without thought, you reach for something. A distraction, a habit, a routine. Something familiar that helps you avoid feeling the thing you do not want to feel. These are your go-to coping mechanisms. They show up faster than your awareness, and they shape far more of your life than you realize. What makes coping mechanisms so sneaky is that they rarely look like coping. They look like scrolling or snacking or diving into work. They look like keeping yourself busy or shutting down emotionally or convincing yourself you are fine. They feel like natural behavior, but each one is actually a quiet escape, a way to protect yourself from a feeling you learned long ago was too heavy, too awkward, or too unsafe to sit with. Your coping style is often built from the emotional environment you grew up in. If your feelings were dismissed, you learned to shut them down before anyone could question them. If your home was unpredictable, you learned to stay alert and overthink everything as a way to feel prepared. If conflict felt dangerous, you learned to please others so you would not trigger it. These responses helped you survive then, but now they activate automatically, long before you decide whether they still serve you. You can usually see your coping pattern in the moments when you feel overwhelmed. Some people go numb. They detach and move through the day like they are watching someone else live their life. Some people overfunction. They clean, plan, organize, and take control of everything around them because controlling the outside world feels easier than dealing with the inside. Others seek comfort in sensory habits. Food, screens, noise, anything that replaces emotional discomfort with physical stimulation. Then there are the quiet coping habits, the ones that seem harmless because they blend in with your personality. You joke your way out of vulnerability. You explain your pain instead of feeling it. You distract yourself with goals so you never have to confront emptiness. You stay helpful so no one notices you are hurting. You stay rational so no one sees that you are scared. These are not flaws. They are strategies you built to protect a younger version of yourself. One reason coping mechanisms are so powerful is that they create a short-term relief loop in your brain. When you avoid a feeling, your nervous system gets a temporary break. Your brain remembers that relief and encourages you to repeat the behavior next time. This creates an automatic cycle. Stress appears. You do the thing. You feel a little better. The strategy becomes reinforced. And eventually the habit becomes so ingrained that you cannot tell whether you chose it or simply reacted. But the real cost shows up quietly. Coping substitutes feel like support, but they block the deeper emotional processing your mind actually needs. You stay disconnected from your real needs because you are busy soothing the discomfort instead of understanding it. You stay in situations that drain you because your coping mechanisms help you endure them. You stay emotionally distant from people because avoiding vulnerability feels safer than risking closeness. You do not grow out of avoidance. You simply become more skilled at it. There is a moment, though, when the pattern becomes visible. It happens when you notice the urge right as it appears. You feel that rising tension, and instead of reaching for your usual escape, you pause. You notice the impulse to shut down. You notice the pull to stay busy. You notice your chest tightening, or your jaw clenching, or your mind sprinting away from the feeling. That single moment of awareness interrupts a lifetime of automatic escape. In that pause, you can ask yourself what is actually happening inside you. Am I anxious because something feels uncertain? Am I overwhelmed because I am carrying too much? Am I sad because something in me needs attention? This simple act of naming your internal experience lowers the intensity. Your brain stops treating it like a threat and starts treating it like information. Gradually, you build a new response. You learn to tolerate the discomfort long enough to understand it. You learn that feelings lose their power when you face them instead of outrunning them. You learn that coping can shift from escape to support. Sometimes that support looks like breathing. Sometimes it looks like reaching out to someone. Sometimes it looks like rest instead of distraction. Your go-to coping mechanisms were built to protect you. But your ability to see them is what frees you. When you stop coping automatically, you start living intentionally. You stop avoiding the parts of yourself that need healing. And you finally create space for the strength you were trying to find through escape. How you prioritize without intention. There is a strange moment that happens every day without you even noticing it. You wake up, your mind starts moving, and before you have consciously chosen anything, your day has already decided itself. Your attention drifts to whatever feels urgent, whatever feels familiar, whatever pulls at your emotions the loudest. And just like that, you begin prioritizing without intention. It feels like you are making choices, but in reality you are following invisible currents that were set long before the morning even started. The truth is that your brain does not naturally prioritize based on importance. It prioritizes based on emotion. Whatever feels stressful, unfinished, or uncomfortable rises to the top, even when it is the least meaningful thing in your life. That is why you answer messages before working on what truly matters. That is why you jump into tasks that give you a quick sense of progress instead of facing the thing that actually moves your life forward. Your mind is wired to reduce discomfort, and reducing discomfort often looks like productivity, but it is really avoidance in disguise. Another force steering your priorities is familiarity. The brain loves routines because they require less energy. You might tell yourself that you will change your habits when life settles down, but the truth is that your mind clings to the familiar because it feels safe. So you keep repeating the same workflow, the same patterns, the same emotional responses. Not because they are effective, but because they require the least amount of mental effort. The systems you use, the order of your tasks, even the way you handle conflict, are often leftovers from an older version of you. There is also the illusion of urgency. Your notifications, your responsibilities, the expectations of other people, they all create a feeling that everything must be addressed immediately. Your nervous system reacts before your logic does. And once you are in that reactive state, you begin prioritizing based on fear of falling behind. You do not stop to ask whether something truly matters. You simply respond to whatever makes the most noise. The loudest task wins, even when it deserves the least of your energy. But beneath all of this is something deeper. Your unconscious priorities reveal your internal beliefs. If you grew up proving your value through productivity, you will prioritize work over rest, no matter how exhausted you are. If you learned that other people's feelings matter more than your own, you will prioritize their needs before considering yours. If you absorbed the idea that success must be earned through sacrifice, you will prioritize struggle over sustainability. Your priorities are not just habits. They are reflections of the roles you once felt required to play. You can see this clearly in the small decisions you make throughout the day. When you choose tasks that make you look busy instead of tasks that move you forward, that is an unconscious priority. When you stretch yourself thin to help others, but ignore your own needs, that is an unconscious priority. When you avoid difficult conversations, but spend time fixing everything around the problem, that is an unconscious priority. These are not intentional choices. They are emotional defaults. The cost of prioritizing without intention is subtle but heavy. You end your day feeling drained but not fulfilled. You make progress but not direction. You stay busy but not aligned. And the most painful part is that you start believing you lack discipline or motivation, when in reality you simply never paused long enough to choose what actually deserves your energy. The shift begins the moment you notice the pattern. You feel yourself reaching for the easy task, and you pause. You feel the urge to jump into something simply because it feels urgent, and you pause. You feel the guilt of putting yourself first, and again you pause. That tiny interruption gives you back your awareness, and awareness gives you back your choice. In that space, you can ask one simple question. What actually matters right now? Not what feels urgent, not what feels familiar, not what other people expect, but what genuinely matters for who you are becoming. This is the moment where your priorities stop being emotional reactions and start becoming conscious decisions. When you begin choosing intentionally, everything changes. Your energy stops leaking into tasks that keep you stuck. Your time begins aligning with your values instead of your fears. You feel less frantic and more grounded. You realize that most of the things you once treated as urgent were never meaningful to begin with. Prioritizing with intention is not about doing more. It is about reclaiming the power to direct your life instead of drifting through it. The moment you pause, the moment you choose, you step out of the automatic version of yourself and into the one who actually leads your life. The thoughts you avoid on purpose. There are certain thoughts you push away so quickly that you barely feel them. They rise for a split second, create a tiny ripple of discomfort, and then you instantly shut the door on them. You distract yourself. You explain them away. You tell yourself you will deal with them later, even though you know you will not. These are the thoughts you avoid on purpose, the ones that feel too heavy, too revealing, or too disruptive to let into the light. What is strange is that these avoided thoughts are rarely dramatic. They are usually simple truths you are not ready to face. The relationship that feels off, the job that drains you, the dream you keep postponing, the boundary you pretend you do not need, the fear that you are becoming someone you never meant to become. Your mind pushes these thoughts away, not because they are impossible to handle, but because acknowledging them demands change, and change threatens the stability your brain works so hard to protect. Your avoidance began much earlier than you think. Maybe you grew up in a home where certain feelings were unwelcome, so you learned to silence anything that might cause tension. Maybe you were responsible for too much too soon, so you learned to ignore your own needs just to keep everything functioning. Maybe you were praised when you stayed strong and criticized when you showed emotion, so you learned to bury anything that made you vulnerable. These early lessons become internal rules, and those rules decide which thoughts are allowed in your awareness and which ones get pushed into the shadows. One of the most common avoided thoughts is the realization that something in your life is no longer working. You sense it in your body long before you admit it with your mind. A heaviness when you wake up, a tightness in your chest when you think about your responsibilities, a subtle dread before conversations you can no longer pretend are fine, but because acknowledging these signals would force you to confront the possibility of change, your mind pushes them away and replaces them with business or excuses. Not now. Not today. Not yet. Another avoided thought is the truth about who you are becoming. Deep down you know when you are outgrowing a role, a belief, or a version of yourself, but stepping into a new identity feels like stepping into uncertainty. So you tell yourself that you are being dramatic, or impatient, or ungrateful. You hold on to the familiar because the familiar offers the illusion of control. Meanwhile, the thought you are avoiding gets louder in subtle ways. Irritation, restlessness, envy toward people living the life you secretly want. These emotions are your avoided thoughts trying to be heard. There are also memories you avoid, experiences that shaped you but hurt too much to revisit. Your mind learned to bury them because at one point, remembering was overwhelming. But as an adult, the avoidance becomes a pattern. You avoid anything that reminds you of that pain. You avoid people who trigger it. You avoid conversations that touch it. You avoid opportunities that might expose it. The memory no longer controls you directly, but the avoidance still does. What makes avoidance so powerful is that it gives you instant relief. When you push a thought away, your nervous system relaxes. Your mind feels safer. The discomfort fades. And because this relief feels so rewarding, your brain repeats the behavior. It becomes a reflex. You avoid, you feel better, and the cycle strengthens. But the cost is long-term. Every avoided thought grows in the dark. It influences your behavior from beneath the surface. It shapes your decisions in ways you never connect back to the thing you are refusing to face. The shift begins the moment you catch yourself in avoidance. You notice the urge to distract yourself, and you pause. You feel your thoughts drifting away from something uncomfortable, and you pause. You sense your mind trying to rush past a feeling, and again you pause. That pause is the doorway. It is the moment where you can invite the thought in instead of shutting it out. You do not have to analyze it. You do not have to solve it. You simply have to allow it. Because the thoughts you avoid are rarely as destructive as the energy you spend running from them. When you let a difficult truth into your awareness, it often feels smaller than you expected. You see it clearly instead of through the lens of fear. You begin understanding what it is pointing to rather than assuming it is a threat. Gradually, the thoughts you once avoided become signals instead of dangers. They guide you toward what needs healing, what needs changing, and what needs releasing. They show you where you have grown and where you still feel stuck. They reveal the parts of your life that are asking for your honesty, and when you face what you once avoided, you stop living in a constant state of emotional negotiation. You stop carrying invisible weight. You stop fearing the truth. Instead, you move with a quiet strength that comes from finally looking at what was never meant to stay hidden. The mental filters shaping your reality. There is something happening in your mind every second that you rarely notice. Before you interpret a situation, before you judge an experience, before you even understand what you are looking at, your brain applies a filter. It sorts information, highlights certain details, ignores others, and then hands you a version of reality that feels complete. But it is not complete. It is edited, and those edits shape the way you live more than you realize. These mental filters are built from your memories, your beliefs, your fears, and the stories you have collected over your whole life. They act like tinted lenses. You forget you are wearing them, so whatever you see feels like the truth. But two people can look at the same moment and walk away with entirely different meanings. The difference is not the moment. The difference is the filter. One of the strongest filters is the threat filter. When you have been hurt, rejected, or disappointed in the past, your brain becomes overly skilled at scanning for danger. It notices the small changes in someone's tone. It notices the silence between messages. It notices the moments when something feels slightly off. Your brain highlights these details not because they are always meaningful, but because at some point they helped you stay safe. This filter makes neutral situations feel risky even when no real threat exists. Then there is the inadequacy filter. If you grew up believing you needed to prove yourself, your mind will always search for signs that you are falling short. No matter how well you do, your attention drifts toward the one thing that went wrong, the one person who did not respond enthusiastically, the one area where you feel behind. Your brain blocks out the evidence of your capability and magnifies anything that confirms your old doubts. You think you are evaluating yourself honestly, but you are really looking through a filter designed to keep you humble, cautious, and small. Another powerful filter is the belief filter. Your brain loves consistency. It wants your experiences to match the beliefs you already hold. So if you believe people cannot be trusted, you notice every behavior that supports that belief and overlook every sign of loyalty. If you believe life is always difficult, you notice the obstacles and downplay the wins. This filter does not show you the world as it is. It shows you the world in a way that protects the ideas you have already accepted. You also have emotional filters that shift depending on your internal state. On a day when you feel confident, the world feels full of possibility. On a day when you feel discouraged, everything looks heavier. The same interaction can feel supportive or threatening depending on the emotion coloring your perception. You are not reacting to the situation itself. You are reacting to the emotional filter your brain placed over it. These filters matter because they influence your decisions long before you think them through. You avoid conversations because your filter tells you they will go badly. You hesitate to take opportunities because your filter highlights the risks instead of the potential. You misinterpret people's intentions because your filter amplifies whatever matches your fears. Your brain shows you a biased version of reality, and you respond as if it is fact. But here is the part that changes everything. Filters can be noticed, and once noticed, they can be questioned. Awareness weakens their automatic power. Imagine catching yourself in the middle of a reaction. You feel yourself getting defensive, and you pause. You realize you are assuming the worst, and you pause. You sense that your mind is focusing on the negative details of a situation, and again, you pause. That pause is where the filter becomes visible. In that moment, you can ask yourself simple but revealing questions. What am I not seeing right now? What else could be true? Is this reaction coming from the present or from my past? Is this situation actually dangerous or just uncomfortable? These questions do not erase the filter, but they create cracks in it. And through those cracks, a more complete picture begins to appear. Over time, you learn to notice the patterns in your perception. You recognize when your threat filter is exaggerating danger. You recognize when your inadequacy filter is shrinking your confidence. You recognize when your belief filter is narrowing your possibilities. And as these patterns become familiar, you start responding to reality instead of reacting to the version your filters created. Your mental filters shaped your reality for years without your permission. But the moment you start seeing them, your reality begins to open. You stop living inside an edited version of the world and start experiencing it with clarity, curiosity, and choice. How you burn or preserve your energy. There is a pattern running your life that you rarely stop to question. It shows up in the way you move through your day, the way you make decisions, and the way you respond to pressure. It is the way you burn or preserve your energy. And the truth is, most people have no idea where their energy actually goes. They think it is work. They think it is stress. They think it is the long list of responsibilities they carry. But the real drain, or the real fuel, often comes from the unconscious habits happening beneath the surface. Your energy is shaped long before you even get out of bed. If you wake up and instantly start worrying, replaying problems, or bracing for the day, you burn energy before your feet touch the floor. Your brain is like a battery. It cannot tell the difference between a real threat and an imagined one. So when your mind starts rehearsing stress, your body reacts as if everything is already happening. Your heart rate rises, your breathing changes, your muscles tense, and without realizing it, you begin your morning already depleted. A second source of energy drain is the silent pressure to be everything to everyone. You answer messages the moment they appear. You take on tasks before asking if they belong to you. You say yes out of habit, not intention. Every time you do this, a little more energy leaks out. You are not just spending physical effort. You are spending emotional currency, and emotional currency drains faster than anything else. But it is not only what you give that drains you. It is what you tolerate. You might not notice how much energy disappears into situations that feel slightly wrong but familiar. The friend who always unloads their problems on you. The job that asks for more than it gives. The conversations where you hold back your real thoughts to keep the peace. These habits do not create explosions. They create slow leaks, and slow leaks are the hardest to detect because they feel normal. Sometimes the biggest drain is the way you refuse to rest. Not because you do not want rest, but because you feel guilty when you slow down. You treat rest like a reward instead of a requirement. You wait for permission from a life that will never give it. And the more you push through exhaustion, the more your productivity becomes a form of self-punishment. You burn energy not by doing too much, but by ignoring the signals telling you to stop. Your energy also shifts based on where you place your attention. When you focus on things you cannot control, your mind spins in circles. You replay conversations. You imagine worst-case scenarios. You try to anticipate reactions you have no power over. This mental overactivity uses real energy. Worry feels invisible, but it drains you faster than physical work ever could. On the other hand, energy grows in very quiet ways. You preserve it every time you honor your limits. You preserve it every time you say no without apology. You preserve it when you choose honesty over pretending. You preserve it when you set boundaries that protect your well-being instead of your image. These choices do not give you an instant boost, but they stop the leaks that once kept you exhausted. Another powerful source of energy preservation is alignment. When your actions match your values, when you move toward what feels meaningful, instead of what feels convenient, you stop wasting energy fighting yourself. You no longer spend your days in internal conflict, trying to be someone you are not. Alignment does not remove effort. It simply channels it in a direction that nourishes you instead of draining you. There is also a surprising truth about energy that most people overlook. Energy increases when you let go of people and situations that run your nervous system in the background. You know the ones. The person you feel tense around even when nothing is happening. The responsibility that weighs on you even when you are not actively dealing with it. The dream you are avoiding because you are afraid to fail. Letting go is not just emotional relief, it is energetic freedom. The shift in your life begins when you start noticing these subtle exchanges. You feel a conversation draining you, and you pause. You feel your mind spiraling towards stress, and you pause. You feel the guilt rising when you try to rest, and again you pause. In that pause, you get to choose differently. You get to ask what nourishes you instead of what numbs you. You get to decide which demands deserve your energy and which ones were only taking advantage of your silence. Over time, you learn that your energy is not random. It is not luck. It is not something you simply wake up with. It is the result of the boundaries you set, the thoughts you allow, the honesty you practice, and the self-respect you embody. You burn energy when you abandon yourself. You preserve it when you return to yourself.